The assumption that the Anglo-Saxon settlement developed from the invasion and mass migration of people from the Germanic coastlands, largely displacing the native people, has been challenged by those suggesting that the changes in material culture and language were caused primarily by a process of acculturation that followed the movement of a relatively small number of people.
That's their side of the story.
Their side.
I mean, that's like Vietnam. We went over there to help out. We don't have a Celtic version of it, and we don't have the British side. But certainly from Bede and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, I mean, that's they're asked over. There's internal feuding going on, and Vortigern, I think it is, who invites the Angles and Saxons over to help out. Hengist and Horsa are the two leaders to come and help, and then they just never go home. They just stay and send for their friends, and that's the beginning of the invasion. But that's, as I say, that's their side.
So the Saxons have already achieved some. They're already there. Mm-hmm. They're a force to be reckoned with, even in the 400s.
Yeah, well, Bede talks about the mid-5th century, doesn't he? 450, somewhere around there, I think. Arthur, we assume, was. I mean, the date for his great battle, if indeed he was leading the British at this period, would be around 500. So yeah, the dates are vague, but one would assume the Angles and Saxons have been around for about 50 years by then.
So if there is a problem for these people to deal with, the Welsh and the Cornish, mm-hmm. it is the Saxon problem. Mm-hmm. I suppose they have to mm-hmm. either pay them off or fight them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there would have been other problems. I mean, the Picts, too, in the north, where they belong to a different Celtic tribe. They speak to this day, a different branch of the Celtic language, with the Gaelic and Gaelic, the Irish and Scottish Celtic languages are different. They're related, but they're different from Welsh and Cornish and Breton. So I think there was some feuding between the Celtic tribes themselves. There are chronicles and saints' lives from a later period on the continent, which suggest that a British leader crossed the Channel to help out in the local wars on the continent, that he was betrayed by the people who invited him over, and that he died fighting in France. Now, that all ties in with Geoffrey of Monmouth's story of a betrayed Arthur, an Arthur who dies by treachery. It also ties in with a rather odd story of Arthur as a continental invader, who indeed in some versions goes all the way to Rome and becomes a Roman emperor. So that Ash has argued quite persuasively that there is some evidence for a British leader, as you say, intervening on the continent in some local war on the continent. The thing that he doesn't deal with, however, is that we do at this period have Gregory of Tours, the great French chronicler, a great Frankish chronicler, and he never mentions this. And it's a big, thick book, The History of the Franks. It's odd that he wouldn't mention this, I think. And it's always the problem of the argument from silence. I mean, it's because something is not mentioned. There are all sorts of reasons why it might not be mentioned. Just as why does Gildas mention the Battle of Mountbatten, but never say that the leader of the British in this battle was Arthur? The name Arthur doesn't appear in Gildas. Similarly, if a hypothetical Arthur went to France, went across the Channel, why does Gregory of Tours not mention him? I mean, it could be that he's dealing with, his book is called The History of the Franks. He's dealing with Frankish history. He's not interested in this British leader who appears briefly. That certainly would be an obvious reason why the Anglo-Saxon tradition, the Venerable Bede and then the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle following on that, why that never mentions Arthur. I mean, why should they be interested in the leader of the people that they defeated? I think that's entirely credible. Why Gildas doesn't mention him is more difficult, I think.
So the Arthur phase, we'll assume that there was an Arthur phase. It led to a long survival of the small kingdoms where descendants of the Britons, the Welsh and the Cornish, as you've mentioned, carried on in spite of the Anglo-Saxons. So this continues to be a problem for them, the preservation of their cultural identity throughout the 600s.
Sure. And continuing right on, I mean, Wales continues to be an independent country right the way through until, the 13th century, I suppose. It's Edward I who finally, by building this string of castles around the perimeter of Wales, finally subjugates the Welsh, although there were Welsh rebellions even in the 14th century. So yeah, there's a long national tradition there. And part of the story of Arthur comes from Welsh myths. There's a thing called the Mabinogion, which preserves fragments of lore, folklore, I suppose. Some of the stories in the Mabinogion do mention Arthur. There are other such fragments too. One obvious example that's often cited, and one of Arthur's from the later period, one of Arthur's knights is a man called Gawain, Sir Gawain. In some early stories, when Gawain is fighting, and indeed even as late as Mallory, when he's fighting Lancelot, he gets stronger towards midday, and then he gets weaker. If you can hold him off till midday, then the chances of defeating him get much better. I mean, this is clearly a sun god. I mean, he's clearly, the sun gets stronger till midday and then wanes. So, when you scratch the surface of some of these figures, you get back to something very much more primitive and elemental, I think. By the time you get this all set down in records, it's very difficult to know what is fact and what is myth anymore, I think. The famous 12 battles that Arthur is supposed to have fought, according to a man called Nennius in the 9th century, I think. Is this historical, or is this just some kind of, is 12 a magic number, and is this just a kind of bardic recital of the kind you would expect? I think by this point you can't really rely on it as sober history anymore. But there certainly is a strong bardic tradition in Wales that survives right on through. I mean, the Mabinogion is the most obvious example, but it goes on and continues right through, and in fact down to the present day, I think. There are still a tradition of Welsh bards who meet at Eisteddfodau and recite poetry to each other. So yeah, that is probably in part a sort of Victorian revivalism, I suspect, but nevertheless, I mean, I think there's probably a pretty strong evidence of a continuous tradition there.
Beyond the 5th, in the Middle Ages, we witnessed the rise of a powerful monarchy under the kings of England, and they encouraged the growth of romantic literature. So I suppose we owe them a debt of gratitude for promoting the Arthurian legend.
In the later period.
As we get into especially at Geoffrey's time, this seems to be actively encouraged by the kings. They seem to promote this idea.
Geoffrey lived and worked under a king called Henry II, who was probably the first great administrator in the English monarchy. William the Conqueror, of course, was and who set up the Domesday Book and so on, was clearly an able administrator. But Henry was really quite a remarkable king, I think. I mean, he's best known for his battle with Thomas à Becket, St. Thomas. But most legal historians would say that the foundation of the common law goes back to Henry II's period, for instance. And it certainly was a period when the monarchy had interests in France. It owned large areas of France. It probably rivaled the English monarchy, rivaled the French monarchy at this period. He was an extremely powerful and ambitious and active and energetic king. And amongst other things, he did encourage, foster learning and literature at his court. Geoffrey of Monmouth was only one of a number of writers of this period. A man called Walter Map, a poet called Marie de France, who also wrote Arthurian material. All belong to this extraordinary period in the 12th century, which was a period of great expansion anyway. It's sometimes referred to as the 12th century Renaissance. I mean, it was a period of great sort of cultural expansion on the continent as well as England. This wasn't an isolated phenomenon. It is one of the most extraordinary things about the whole Arthurian story is how quickly it takes off. From being an obscure Celtic monarch, presumably popular amongst the Welsh, within half a century, he's one of the great Christian heroes of the West. In the 9 worthies, the 3 Christian worthies, Charlemagne, Charles of Boulogne and Arthur. Within 50 years, he's known from Iceland in the north to Sicily in the south. It's quite extraordinary.
But we could be a bit skeptical about Arthur's Christianity.
Oh, yes, indeed. I think there's no way of knowing. The gap of time between the accounts and the putative real Arthur, there's no way of knowing what. I mean, he would have been presumably Christian.
And you keep building up within the minds of your subjects.
Right.
Say the kings of England have always been like demigods,
right.
So don't you forget it.
Well, of course, what it does do, what it could be used to do is argue for continental claims. This is after all the period of the Angevins, who own, as I say, a large part of southwest France. And if you can look back to an English king who was at one period emperor of Rome, who went south with an army and conquered Rome, that gives you a kind of legitimizes your continental aspirations, perhaps. Most European monarchies of this period, most European kingdoms of this period trace their ancestry back. Rome itself, after all, traced its ancestry back to the fall of Troy. The Aeneas, the hero of Virgil's Aeneid, is the founder of Troy in Virgil's view, and is the founder of Rome, and therefore gives a Trojan ancestry to the Roman Empire.